Well, we have a special guest today, Mike Hazzard, and Mike and I have worked together for many years. He is our czar of everything compliance as it relates to TCPA, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Um, and we trust Mike absolutely on the Ylopo side. We kind of follow his directives and his team's directives as it relates to this topic. I'll kind of talk through, on the Ylopo side, in terms of what we're doing and our perspective. I will say, obviously, what you're going to hear here is how Ylopo is dealing with TCPA, and our policies around TCPA compliance. Obviously, you should rely on your own counsel as counsel's advice. And so, we are kind of offering you our systems perspective and how we are dealing with this topic and what we believe is compliance. But no way are we suggesting that you shouldn't consult your own counsel around this topic if you wanted to, right? So with that being said,
Just one housekeeping. You guys are going to have questions about what he's saying. Okay. In an effort to try to get them answered, just put them in the Q&A. I see three people have already put questions in. And yes, this is being recorded. Yes, it's going to be emailed to you. It will also be on ylopo.com/webinars, right? Webinars? Let me
Media.
look.
Media.
Or media. Well, ylopo.com/media. The recording will be there. It will be emailed to you, and we are recording it. All right. There you go, G.
And
Sorry.
then I'm gonna piggyback on Barry, and then I'm gonna shut up. Some of these questions we know we're gonna be covering, so don't think we're ignoring you. I just want to keep the flow going. But if it is something in there we haven't addressed, we'll definitely circle back to it. So that's why it needs to be Q&A. But some of these I know are coming up, so we're gonna let that come into our cadence, and then we'll hit anything that's not touched. So we'll clear those out once we touch them.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So, Mike, welcome. Do you mind first starting by sharing your background and your credentials?
Sure. Thank you, G, and thanks everybody for being here. So my name is Mike Hazzard. I'm a partner at the law firm called DLA Piper. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I've been practicing law continuously since 1998. I grew up in kind of the early days of competitive long distance and competitive local exchange services, and my practice has evolved since then. Since about 2010, I've been involved in text messaging. My first text messaging project was with Twilio, and they had about 10 people launching programmable SMS. At that point, I'd never heard of an API. There's some early work with many of the platforms that offer messaging today in all kinds of different verticals, from like real estate like Ylopo to folks in healthcare, many other systems. We represent global brands, all kinds of folks. Done a lot at the FCC. I've been in, at least a dozen federal district courts on TCPA matters. So I have pretty broad, long, and deep experience in TCPA, both from the policy side and in the federal district court side, kind of beating down TCPA trolls and others. The one thing I just would like to kind of say before we get started, I'm going to give you our thoughts on matters, and I'm going to give you my most honest assessment I can on the questions you have. TCPA, as you know, can be pretty high context. So you should always confer with your compliance professional, whether that's a lawyer or non-lawyer or somebody in the business that knows your use case the best and knows how your business is operating. But again, as directed by G, I'll do my level best to give you, full and straight answers to all the questions you have.
Awesome.
And would it be fair to say that you're giving us the legal advice that you gave Ylopo to run our systems? Is that a good assessment, or?
Yeah, what I'd say is what I'll say here is based on legal advice I've given to Ylopo. But I think it's important for everybody to understand that Ylopo is my client, and if you're an audience member on the webinar today, you are not my client unless we have some other relationship. I don't even know who's on here.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that people don't, you kind of can't bank on my advice here. You can talk to me about it. I'm easy to find. There aren't many lawyers named Mike Hazzard at DLA Piper. If you ask around a little bit, people will probably, you can find me super easily. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody, one-on-one after, or talk to your compliance professional in addition with the views that I have. And again, there are a spectrum of views on some of the TCPA items, and it's an area where everybody knows there can be different risk tolerances and different approaches taken by different companies based on their use case and their business plans.
Okay, great.
Okay, cool. So, I think I want to start, with asking you questions, Mike, about the changes that are happening on 127. I think a lot of our clients have heard something is changing on 127. And so can you start there with what are the new changes that are taking effect?
Yes, I think kind of the most important change that's scheduled to take effect on the 27th is what the FCC is calling closing the lead generation loophole. And what the FCC means by that is that they are moving to a form of one-to-one consent, so that the recipient of the communications has to give consent directly to each entity that's going to be communicating with the recipient. There are some nuances there. On the one hand, we have artificial voice, pre-recorded voice, or AI voice. So that's all for sure moving into the one-to-one consent category. Then there's this issue of text messages, which if you're sending text messages using what's known as an automatic telephone dialing system, which is a statutory defined term, the consent would also apply. But as a practical matter, Ylopo and other entities utilizing text messages do not use automatic telephone dialing systems. Rather, they call from lists, and calling from a list is not an automatic telephone dialing system, and therefore the one-to-one consent requirements will not be extended there. That said, you still need to worry about do not call. Do not call is a separate consent requirement. The FCC explicitly noted in its order that the changes to prior express written consent for one-to-one calling is not being flowed through to do not call. So the consent rules for do not call are not changing. There's a lot there. Sorry.
Yeah. So let me unpack that for a second. So we have, two legs to Ylopo communication with leads, right? We have our texting and we have our voice, which are both AI powered, right? So, how is this, if any, applicable to texting, to the texting side, right? And, I'll preface this by saying that Ylopo has, on Mike's guidance, been doing one-to-one consent on all Ylopo generated leads since we knew about this. I think it was early last year, right? And so, all Ylopo leads for, the past year at the very least have always been one-to-one consent, right? And what I mean by that is, I'll just screen share really quickly.
G's first time screen sharing, I think. We can't hear you, Barry. So I think
I think we dropped him for a second, but I think what he was about to go over is the opt-in process. And our opt-in process has been dialed in and ready for one-party consent for over a year now. And while we're waiting for G, one distinction that I want to make that I'm curious about, Mike, you made a distinction between calling through a list and a dialer. So without knowing the intricacies of dialers, I guess what I'm hearing is there's a type of dialer that doesn't use a list. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct.
And that's what this law is about. All right, G, sorry. So you were going over the one-party consent, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. Inopportune time for my laptop to run out of battery. Because this plug in my hotel does not work. That's why. So, I'll screen share this a little later, but what that means is when a lead registers, when they fill out their phone number on our screen, we actually say you are giving consent to, Better Homes and Garden NARG, right? Or NAGR, sorry. And every single agent and their team or their business is stated in the consent, right? That's what it means, right? So you are, absolutely in compliance with Ylopo, with one-to-one consent. When leads come into your Ylopo ecosystem, right? That's new leads, returning leads, whatever is the case, right? So we're in compliance, right? So, Mike, I think my question is, our clients buy leads from a lot of sources, right? From portals, from, other sources. And some of these sources, as of today, do not have the same one-to-one consent language. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can.
Okay, cool. And so let's say you are buying a lead from a source that has proper TCPA opt-in language, as was the case before 127, right? So it doesn't state your name on the form, but it does have TCPA opt-in. On the texting side, what are you able to use Ylopo technology to text the lead?
Yeah. So again, not knowing, I'd want to know a little bit more about how the number is released to the recipient that obtains the lead, like what kind of relationship they have with the person releasing their telephone number. So I think so. The answer is, as a general matter, using the Ylopo system, the Ylopo system is not an automatic telephone dialing system, as that term is used in the TCPA. So if the telephone number is released to the person making the call, that's all that they need, is that release of the number to them. And then they can go ahead and make that call, but they will want to run that against do not call to make sure that there's not a potentially reassigned number issue or some other issue where there's been a revocation of the consent.
So Mike, I mean, if you give consent, you fill out a form, right? The consumer knows that lead is going to an agent. They don't know which agent it's going to, right? But they opted into TCPA consent, right? Does that override? Like, can you contact this person even if they're on the DNC, right? So I want to make that clear, right?
Based on that affirmative TCPA consent, yes.
Yeah, because
I'm going to talk about repeating that scenario right there. I think it's worth repeating, just make sure everybody caught that.
Yeah, so basically, even if you're on the DNC list, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, if you give TCPA consent, right?
Yes.
You've given the consent to contact this person.
Yes,
right?
that TCPA consent would override the do not call list.
Yeah. And so, we on our side carefully vet the sources by which we will text leads, right? And I'm talking about new leads. I'll talk about database in a second, right? And so I actually send Mike the TCPA language of a vendor that we're going to import leads and text from, and we don't whitelist that source until Mike says, yes, it's good, right? So like I'll send him Zillow or Realtor.com's TCPA and he'll give me the thumbs up, right? And there are vendors where we say, this isn't good enough, we're not going to text that source. Or we tell the vendor, you need to change this language to this language in order for us to text the source, right? But, our policy on the Ylopo side is for leads that you are importing that have been whitelisted, we are going to text those leads, right? With AI texting, right? And so, nothing really changes substantively. If they've been on the whitelist and they've kept their TCPA the same, we are going to work them via texting in the same way, right? That's our Ylopo policy, and that's how AI texting is going to work, right? So let me go to voice, right? So once again, we have been doing, since we have been doing AI voice, one-to-one consent on that front, right? But Mike, if we have a lead from a source that has TCPA language, they know the lead's routed to the agent, but they do not have one-to-one consent with that agent. What happens with AI voice?
So with the AI voice, so there are two things here. So with the one-to-one consent, there would need to be so it's not so much that it's AI voice. It's really like there's messaging and then there's voice of all kinds. So it could be pre-recorded voice or AI voice. So we're in that voice category. There needs to be one-to-one consent. Although what I will say is like this hasn't been implemented yet, but the way we understand it based on the language of the FCC's order is there needs to be that one-to-one consent. Now, a related wrinkle is that the one consent needs to be within the same sphere as the consent that was given. So it's for the similar purpose. So here we're really all talking about real estate related communications. So we're pretty clearly all in the same sphere. So the question is going to be whether the consent is broad enough to include the third party that's getting the the lead. And there's some question about how that'll be implemented.
Yeah. And I think that, the summary of this is we will not be calling new leads going forward that do not give one-to-one consent, right? And this is the reason that AI voice right now only calls Ylopo leads, because we know we get one-to-one consent, right? And, we are not, as of right now, until this is implemented across the industry, going to roll out a third-party AI voice, extension, right? For this reason, so we've had a lot of requests from clients like, hey, why don't you use AI voice to call my third-party lead, portal lead, or whatever is the case. This is the reason for it, right? Because we anticipated this.
In G, I don't know, there's one other element just I think that's worth noting is that the FCC has made it very clear that all of this is prospective, and that's why there was a long time to kind of implement it, and it's all going to be going forward. There's nothing in the FCC's order that says that old consents are invalidated. So we believe it'll have to get tested, but I believe personally, and others I work with believe that old consents should still be valid. As you indicate, G, it's like kind of going forward. If you're obtaining new consents, that they need to be one-to-one after or on January 27th and after. Now, there's an open question. Other people disagree with about that and say that all your leads need to be kind of brought up to that one-to-one consent level. But again, for such a big change, in my view, the FCC would have had to have said that the old consents are no longer valid, and they didn't say that.
Yeah, and you beat me to the punch. So everything I've just talked to has been about new leads, right? On your database, our operating procedure is that if they are from a whitelisted source that that you have previously had consent for, we're still texting and we're still calling those leads because the consent did not go away and get wiped out because of this, right? And there has been other, webinars or other folks I've heard where they disagree with this stance. And this is where, you have to kind of, consult your own counsel and make your own decisions in that regard. But our platform, we are operating as if you previously had consent, your consent has not been wiped out, and we are still going to use our AI technology to contact those leads.
All right. So I want to pause there for a second because there are probably a half a dozen. I'll go through a market complete there, asking how long does consent. So any of the Ylopo leads that we obtained the one-to-one consent on, with these changes, they're following up with them now. They're doing that did not change. They don't need to get new consent. They don't need to go back and grab any of those on the Ylopo generated leads that they've got in their databases, or if they look and know that they had one-to-one consent on their other leads in their database.
Yeah, and while that is being said, I will emphasize, before texting, we're good to go. We're doing texting, same business as normal, right? But with AI voice, when we release this product to the database, and by the way, everyone who asked me, when are you going to start calling my database? When are you going to start calling my database? This is one of the reasons that it's taken so long, because we want to make sure compliance, we are, triple compliant, right? And so for database, with our database product that we will be rolling out very soon, when the lead comes back to the website, which is when we are going to contact them, right? They are going to give us reconsent, right? So there's going to be a pop-up that comes up with their phone number auto-completed, with a press this button to log in. And in that TCPA language on that page, there will be one-to-one consent, right? So even though, our standing policy is that if you had previous consent before, you're good to go. We are still going to basically get consent again on our website, right? So I want to make that very clear, right? There will be other products that we launch where we are calling and texting your old leads, at scale. Those are things that we're testing out right now. But our typical flow for our database product on the voice side is going to work off of priority signals, off of people who have come back to our website, who have given consent again, right?
Yeah. Another question here. I want to be clear too. And just Mike, if you'd clarify, there are a couple in here. What if we have bad numbers? Are we still okay reaching out by email? This has nothing to do with email, direct mail. This is only call text, correct?
It has nothing to do with email for sure. Nothing to do with direct mail. And again, there really are kind of two different spheres that we should consider: the texting and the voice. And that's what we're really talking about here. We're talking about texting and voice, and whatever kind of voice it is.
Yeah.
And if you want us to wait to do questions, we can, because they're piling up, but lots of questions on DNC. So
Yes.
if they are on the do not call and they've agreed to opt in, so they register. When we say opt in, everybody, that means they registered on our website or like Zillow's website. They registered, and in that registration, they've agreed to be contacted. If they're on the do not call list, how long do we have to contact them? I know some people have said something about 90 days. How does that apply in this scenario?
So that a consent is valid until it's revoked.
Hold on. A consent is valid until it's revoked. Where did that 90-day thing come from?
I've heard different pieces on the 90 days, and we've actually reached out to some of the lawyers that we understand are talking about the 90 days. As best we could tell, there's a notion that short of consent, you can have an established business relationship with a party related to a transaction or related to an inquiry. And so if you have a business relationship with somebody, but you don't quite have a consent, if it's related to a transaction, you can contact them up to 18 months. If it's for like an inquiry that's not a purchase, you can contact them up to 3 months. So, but those are instances where you don't have a consent in a like a TCPA consent, and you're relying on this kind of lesser form of the established business relationship.
Yeah, and I want to kind of make sure we clarify this. Everything that we've talked about up to this point, that where there is clearly no kind of limitations until they opt out, right, is leads that have signed up for TCPA consent, right? The next topic I want to talk about, because I think this is where there's some confusion around, is leads that do not opt in for TCPA, right? That means your Sphere leads, that means your farming list, that means lists that you buy, et cetera.
Manually created, right? Manually created leads.
Manually created, et cetera, that did not go through and give their opt-in from TCPA compliance perspective, right? So I want to ask you questions about that, because I think that's where a lot of the DNC confusion comes in. But Mike, let me ask you this first. Is there anything in 127 that impacts DNC, et cetera, or is that something that has existed for a long time?
I'm sorry. Can you
Yeah, so I'm saying specific to the 127 change, right? is there anything about this issue of calling leads around DNC, or is this
No.
an issue that has existed for a long time, I
That's a
guess?
pre-existing issue. That's an existing issue. And I think where that's coming from, I don't, I'm speculating when I say this, but I think people are saying that, like, maybe I don't have one-to-one consent, but I do have an existing business relationship, so I can do stuff for 90 days or 18 months, depending on what the relationship is. So it's just a little, yeah, it's so I think that that's a reaction to what you can do if you don't quite have one-to-one consent, what other defenses you might have. But I haven't talked to the people that really have been espousing that view in spite of my efforts to do so.
Yeah, and so I think the point I'm trying to make here is that, the exposure that you have when you are calling leads that don't have consent with you is an exposure you've always had, right? And so it is not a bad thing to clean up your practices in that regard. But it is a pre-existing issue, right?
Yeah,
And you
for
guys
sure.
should be aware of that, right? And I'm not saying don't you should be abiding by those because you've had exposure if you've been doing it. If you've been calling leads on a farm list that are on the DNC, you're already violating. You are already causing issues for yourself, right? And so this is a good time to clean those things up, but that doesn't have anything to do with the changes that are happening on 127, right?
Correct.
So going to that area, Mike, if I buy a list of leads, I have no TCPA opt-in from those leads. I download it from the MLS or whatever is the case. What are the procedures I have to follow to be compliant?
Well, I mean, you can have like an intern call them all and get consent. If you're gonna market to those people, you need consent. If you're gonna engage in telemarketing, trying to sell those something, there's a separate category for informational communications, where if the number is released to you, you can call people for informational purposes. But if you're doing telemarketing, you need consent. And the one thing I should also say here is these are all like FCC defined terms. The way people might think of like marketing in the business place or in the real estate office may very well be somewhat different than what the FCC specific definition is. Um, but again, I think you always want to be thinking about if anybody questions you, how would you say that you got the consent to contact them? And then I guess one of the things I've seen it flash up on the chat is, there's this big potential category of wrong numbers, and wrong numbers, are a difficulty because the consent is really from the human being to the person that's going to be calling them. And the telephone number ends up just being a proxy for the human being. Like many people on this call, I've had the same telephone number for 30 years on my mobile phone. But if I change providers or dump my phone or whatever, and somebody else got my phone, and they started getting my text messages, like, that consent was from me, not from that person. So, that you don't have consent to text somebody that's, got a new telephone number, or the consent goes to the person, not to the telephone number, essentially.
Yeah. So would it be safe to say, Mike, that if you're calling a farming list or whatever's the case, that you should have a tool that tells you which leads are on the DNC, and then you shouldn't call those people?
Yeah, for sure. That's always a good way to go.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a bunch of platforms that do this really well, like I know, for instance, back in the day, as example, if you called on RedX or one of those similar type platforms, there's like DNC scrubbing services kind of available as part of those dialings. I know and talk to the owners of Easy Verify and Call Action as an example. I'm sure there's other products as well where they are taking this very seriously and they provide that DNC scrubbing, etc. So if you are going to go and do farm lists, cold calls, etc., as part of your practices, highly recommend that you implement one of those types of solutions, right? So, for non-opt-in TCPA leads, if you are doing that, you absolutely need to make sure you buy by the DNC. Gabe, Barry, I'm not reading the Q&As. Does that answer that question, or do other people have nuanced questions about that?
I think that answers some. Because there are people asking how do we identify them. I guess one of them that's been in here several times. So I think we've covered Ylopo leads fairly well, right? We're getting one-to-one. We've got consent until they revoke it. All the other leads that maybe they don't have the consent on, as Ylopo is engaging them, bringing them to websites, they do hand raiser activities or seller 2.0. What are the items or the activities in which Ylopo is getting to where they're getting that consent? And what will we be doing in the future, I think, when those happen to show that in the CRM to them? So like if they come in, if it's a sphere lead or it's whatever it is that there's no consent, and they come onto the website and do a showing request, right? In our verbiage on there, are we getting consent at that point, or is that's where we're putting in consent? What are we doing on that side?
Yeah, like reconsent. Basically, we uploaded our Sphere database. We didn't get consent from any of them to send. We don't have one party consent, but then they register on our website.
Yeah, and she correct me if I'm wrong. I think when they register on the website, you are getting consent.
That's right.
So
That's
that would
right.
be a valid opt-in,
Yeah.
and then you're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I think
like,
what Ylopo is, I mean, as I understand what G and the team are doing, and I talk with them all the time, is just any kind of a further contact, you're just grabbing that consent, grabbing that consent, grabbing that consent.
yeah. So as an example, and I've seen some people mention this, like a lot of our clients upload their Sphere and upload a farming list into remarketing, right? And then we're targeting them across social media. They click on that registration link, they come back to the website, form pops up, right? They register. Okay, you have consent, So I think another question I've seen here is, what does consent mean, right? Like if I talk to the client and they say, yes, you have consent to text me, or I email the client and say, do you have consent to text me or call me? Is that considered consent?
It is. Yes. It can be hard to prove though. So if like I tell G, hey G, send me all your hot listings. I love it. And then I forget that I said that to him. And then my good friend Barry says, hey, let's go make some money on some TCPA complaints. And I'm like, yeah, I'm getting all these calls from G, and I never consented to him. G's like, you did, man. You told me like this. Then it's like G's word against mine, and then that just ends up being like a morass. So
Yeah.
it's good to have like the form filled out or some kind of record of the consent.
Yeah. It's a big reason I think why we should be using CRMs, right? So that these text
Yeah.
conversations where they're saying, yes, send me listings, yes, help me, or we
Yeah,
have it recorded
exactly.
on the phone calls, or when Ylopo gets the registration and pushes that registration form log to your CRM with a date and timestamp.
Yeah.
That's great why all of this is happening, and why we really need to be encouraging our teams. As if there wasn't enough reasons prior to this, they should be using I'll just use Follow Boss as an example, but their Follow Boss number for texting and calling with the recording, because everything is logged in the system with the recording and a date and timestamp.
And I'm trying to assimilate as many of the questions into like one question as possible. So it seems as though there's a lot of varying questions about, let's say John Smith registers on my website and puts in the wrong phone number. Is consent based off of the phone number or the person? Because what if they used a different service to get the phone number of John Smith? So John Smith opted in, put the wrong number. I go and get a different number for John Smith and I try to reach it. Because I got the number from a different service, am I allowed to contact him through automated means, or is it's
Yeah, I mean, as a technical matter, that's a good question, because it's kind of like the reverse wrong number problem. Like John Smith actually did consent,
yeah.
and then he transposed a number in his telephone number. But John Smith has consented, and if you can identify his correct telephone number, that's a valid consent. Again, it would have kind of a difficult proof element. And I just want to emphasize what Gabe said is just so spot on. Whenever we have litigation on this kind of stuff, you're always getting records from the CRM. Like that's what we would get ideally is, some CRM record of all the text messages, what the interactions are, whether they replied stop or did anything like that, and then we can match that up to when they opted in, what the consent looked like.
Yeah.
So
There's a nice paper trail, and I know G and his team spent a lot of time kind of building all that out.
So when you guys are hearing Mike go over this, right? This is like a good principle for you to use, generally speaking, in many of the questions you guys are asking. Because it sounds to me, Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's a varying degree of interpretation with some of this stuff. So it's good, it's a good idea to always get opt-in, keep really good records. And then the last question on this, if they what is considered revoking? So we have our AI texting, revoking consent. We have our AI texting the leads. If the lead says stop, right? Our AI stops texting. Does that mean we have to stop calling altogether because they texted our AI stop as a business owner? Or can we continue to reach out maybe via calling, for example? Or is it like, oh, they've revoked consent, I need to stop contacting them altogether?
Yeah, and that's a really great question, Barry. And what I would say is, it depends on the scope of the consent.
Okay.
So, let's say you had a general consent
Mhm.
for voice and texting and all this stuff. You just had like one general consent. Someone replies stop. I think the assumption would be that the consent is completely revoked.
Okay.
If you had a separate form of consent, or you'll have some people that have multiple kind of offerings, like you're going to consent for real estate communications and maybe mortgage related financing based communications. If you have two consents and then you reply stop to the mortgage stuff, the consent for the real estate listing stuff would continue.
Okay.
So it's very, very context specific, but you just want to think is, if you looked at that consent, was it the entire relationship or like a narrow vein of that relationship?
Well, and is Ylopo's consent a one general consent? Is it a separate from texting and calling, or is it one general consent?
It's one general consent, but I do want to emphasize, because I forgot to mention this, we are adding a separate step for co-marketing partners, right? And so what's going to happen on your lead registration form, working on this right now, is when you press consent, which, by the way, for us, appears when they enter their phone number, right? So there's no confusion. You enter your phone number, you give TCPA consent. We are going to do a second form with that phone number pre-popped, where they press accept, where we then say, and we're also, in a client-friendly way, sending this to your mortgage lender, right? And that mortgage lender's information is going to be there, right? So for our co-marketing partners, we're going to essentially get a separate consent for the realtor, and we're going to get a separate consent from the lender. Okay, so I want you to make that distinction. Now, one area that I will say you need to watch out for is if you are using competing services for your texting and voice, right? So, Mike, in the scenario, let's say you're using Ylopo and you're using another, that person opts out of like that texting service. So you're sending them a separate drip, right? And they say stop, right? Ylopo doesn't know that. We don't have data on this separate opt-out,
Yeah.
right? In that scenario, does the agent need to opt out of Ylopo texting on their side manually?
Generally, I would say yes. And because that consumer has revoked the consent, and it may only be that the other entity, the non-Ylopo entity, is the only one that's honoring that because Ylopo wasn't told. And we also see this happen in instances where people, if they don't port their stuff carefully, where you move from one system to another system, and either opt out isn't tracked over correctly, or internal do not call isn't tracked over correctly. And so then you have like leads that have opted out in your CRM that you're bringing to the new vendor.
Yeah.
So,
And we have been texting for like 6 years with AI, right? And there hasn't been a lot, but there have been some situations with a TCPA troll of some sort, reaching out to our client, right? And in all cases where the lead had communication through the Ylopo platform, we are able to show them a paper trail. This is your IP address you registered from, with this consent and blah, 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 blah. And, we haven't had a situation where that goes beyond that, right? Where like, here's the actual screenshots, but if you are using another service and someone says stop to us, right? We stop, right? And then you're still texting them from another service that you have potential issues with. And that's not something we can solve for you, right? And so, you do have to make sure, and this is, and I don't mean this to be self-serving, but it's safer for you just to use one service, because of that reason, right? If you're not, then you got to be Johnny on the spot in terms of opting out that lead from the other service if we get signal, right? I will also say on the Ylopo side, we take, opt out like in a very conservative approach, right? There is a hard opt out, which is like stop, but if this person says, leave me alone, blah, 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 right? We mark that lead as not interested, right? And we pass you that tag, not interested, right? That is not a hard opt out, in the traditional sense, but we stop communicating and texting that lead once they reach the not interested stage, right? So we're kind of going above and beyond in that regard on the AI side to stop communication, with those people.
And just to that point, kind of more generally, is like general compliance is pretty readily achievable with Ylopo and companies, but there are some people that are like, how close can I get to the edge? And it's like, if you stay on our side of the railing, you're going to be in very good shape. If like I tell people, if you want to go over the railing and get to the edge, like I don't know when the ground's going to kind of crumble beneath you there. So, taking that conservative approach, like you're talking about, G, is a good way to go. But different people have different tolerances.
Maybe some clarity to there, but a few posts in here again. I'm trying to summarize as well. A little bit of the difference between somebody who's on DNC versus not DNC. Is there a difference on what's needed on maybe these other leads outside of Ylopo? Is there a difference on those versus for the outreach?
Yeah, I would say that the difference is primarily in the text messaging sphere, because like you really need, as a general matter, if you're calling from a list or texting from a list like Ylopo, you really don't need consent because you're not using an automatic telephone dialing system. So if someone's not on the DNC, like you can just you can just roll.
Right. So we're really thinking, like, as we're talking about a lot of this in the questions, we're really trying to focus for the most part those that are on the DNC list.
Yeah. Okay. So if they're on the DNC list, then you will need a consent from them to send them marketing messages. Now, an important thing about the DNC list that some people don't understand is that the DNC only applies to telemarketing. So if it's like an informational message or a transactional message, DNC doesn't apply to those messages. It's only the telemarketing messages.
Got it. Okay. Clearing some of these out. Let's see here.
Yeah. And I had some questions about like, again, how do we notify you of consent? And we pass a tag that says opt out, to you when a lead has opted out, right? And so that's like very clear on our side. But, we also opt out leads that are not interested. Technically, have they opted out? No, but we do that from a safety perspective. So I guess this is a good question, Mike. If a lead says, leave me alone, right? Ylopo stops texting, right? Is that considered an opt-out for the agent?
is that considered an opt-out from
Meaning they haven't said stop, but they said leave me alone, right? Like,
To AI.
does the agent still have TCPA consent?
So I think the better answer is, or the answer is probably not. Like the rule's a little vague. Like the rule is like if the consumer indicates they don't want messages anymore, they're opted out, or they can opt out by any reasonable means. Like, so the question's always going to be, are these like softly negative things? Do they rise to the level of an opt out or not? But I think, the Ylopo approach of passing back to the customer the information that the consumer's not interested is, like someone's saying here, leave me alone is an opt-out sentiment. These people probably aren't playing hard to get. And then I think the other thing that you got to kind of like worry about is like, that are people trying to trap you? And the biggest problem we see in TCPA generally are people running smash and grabs, like people trying to get somebody else's phone number in order to get messages for somebody else or calls from somebody else, and then do these suits. And you see one individual person who's filed 20, 30, 40 TCPA complaints, and they do it all with the same law firm. So a lot of times those serial plaintiffs are kind of working hand in glove with a smash and grab plaintiff's lawyer to have a little cottage industry to get even like $5,000-$10,000 settlements that kind of keep the lights on as they're doing other cases. So again, if I think the safest answer is if you get a negative sentiment back, opt them out. And I have one group I work with is like, when in doubt, opt them out. That's going to be the safest way to go.
Yeah.
There's
The best practices.
so many questions about consenting and reconsenting. So let me make sure I understand for the benefit of the group. If someone registers on our Ylopo site, it is your legal opinion. So this is the Ylopo site. Is it your legal opinion that consent has stayed, even if it's a 2-year-old Ylopo lead or a 3-year-old Ylopo lead, they consented to be contacted by us? Does that consent persist as long as they haven't revoked it in some way by saying stop, leave me alone, or something like that?
Yes.
So that's as clear as you get, guys. That just answered probably 20 questions in the chat in different formats. If they have at one time registered on our website, they have consented to TCPA consent. If they have not said stop or leave me alone, that consent has not revoked. You'll know that they consented to be contacted if you have a registration note in your CRM. That registration note shows up when they have clicked submit, and that box is checked that says, I want to be contacted. Yeah. So I think that answered like all those.
There's about another 10 that tiptoe around this. So I'll try and explain this, hopefully, Mike. So around the stop or the no, especially with AI, there are situations where agents have made connection and maybe AI is still on. The lead is speaking with Barry, the agent. AI goes out, so they say stop, but they're still communicating with Barry, and there's texts or calls in the CRM saying, yes, help me send me properties. They are fine to continue communicating because they've got consent with Barry to help them out, even though they said stop to the AI phone number.
Yeah, that's quite a corner case there. I mean, I think if the consumer's, continuing on the conversation with Barry, it doesn't sound like there was an opt-out there. I might need some more specifics of what it really looked like, but again, okay. I think if the consumer's continuing to communicate with Barry and continuing to want communications from Barry, then the consent has not been revoked, from what it sounds like. Yeah. But again, sometimes these edge cases, they're very, very context specific.
Yeah. And then G, I think I asked you this one, but it's in here a couple times. Those that are using the Ylopo Open House app versus just signing them in manually, those using the Ylopo Open House tool, that has consent in it, correct? That has the language we need in it? You're on mute.
Yes, and even on your branded website. Yes. So people have asked, like, what if someone requested information about me? Well, if it happened on the branded website, it's good, right? If it happened on another website, then you have to look at their TCPA language and see if it works or not. And if you registered it on another website, unless it is in our whitelist, then we're not going to automatically text them.
And open house leads?
If they filled out the open house registration form on Ylopo.
All right.
Yeah.
So open house tool, guys, this just adds more value. I know all of us are annoyed about that big disclaimer. I wish we could make it smaller. We should talk about that. But when you use the open house tool, there's a big disclaimer that says you agree to allow us to contact that. When they submit that open house registration, they are agreeing, they are registering, and that means they're giving TCPA consent. So you are good. And per our attorney's advisement, that consent is not revoked unless they revoke it in some way, like stop, leave me alone, and give a negative response of some kind.
Yeah. And Mike, we'll get I'll commit to making sure we get follow-up to everybody that registered too. Because it has come up and I've had a few direct messages on if they're talking to me, the agent, we're showing property, we're doing whatever, but then say stop to AI because it goes out. Do we have consent? I mean, your BBA has consent. There's a lot of different things in here. So we'll get clarity on that. Again, best practices, make sure everything is in the CRM, right? So that way if they are communicating with you, yes, send me these properties and do all that, you have consent, right? Or re-consent if you want to call it that, right? So we just need to make sure that everything's happening in the CRM so that you've got it. I think it sounds like a lot, but once you get your cadence and everything down and you're using best practices, this isn't going to be that difficult. Just make sure you're going through. For us, also, like if you have a lot of leads in your database that you're not sure if you have it, those non-Ylopo leads, all the more reason why you should have them on listing alerts or remarketing and all that. So when they come in and they get prompted to register through your Ylopo search site, you're getting that opt-in and that consent.
And I've seen something just flash up on the screen, which was about using email to get people to opt in. And I think that's exactly right.
And if they say, leave me alone, and then see a Facebook ad, re-register on our website. So we have a new registration note. Okay, yeah. So guys, if they said, leave me alone, and Facebook keeps running ads, you leave them alone. You don't call them. You just leave them alone. And Facebook is running ads. Your listing alerts are being sent to them. They click it. A box pops up, says, oh, if you want to view more homes, register. They register. When you see a registration note in your CRM, you know what that looks like. Just a regular registration note. That means they've opted in and given consent to be contacted again. They've basically annulled the revokement, and now they're saying, give me a call.
Email works, and Mike said, I'll share really quick. We're going to put this together in a mailer. Michelle, I think you're on here. For those of you, if you're not sure if you have consent, you think you're just wanting to be extra careful, we've got agents like that. I've actually gone through and written a bunch to have time for the 27th. I'll share this with everybody. This already has the Robert Slack or the follow-up boss merge fields. I'll remove this to where it does not have the Robert Slack in here, but I'll share this with everybody. It's a whole bunch of different text templates, past clients, sphere, people you've met, not met. If you want something that you can copy and paste and put into your text template folders and follow-up boss, I'll get these shared out for Michelle to send to everyone. That way, if you just want an extra layer to make sure you have it documented on ones you're unsure of.
So that's huge. So basically, people that you don't have consent to contact, so they didn't register on the Ylopo site, this text could be sent that Gabe is going to provide, and you could get consent. And this question, I see 5 of this question, forms of this question. With phone dialers, there's a triple line dialer. It calls 3 lines at once. There's also a single line dialer. People are asking, can I use dialers anymore? Like, how does this work? Any guidance there, Mike?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're, it is like super like legal speak here, but the FCC, we're going to talk about the FCC. Like there are some other places, like at the state level, like in Florida, and some other places where it's a little more complicated. But nationally, the TCPA uses the term automatic telephone dialing system, and the only technology is that to be an automatic telephone dialing system, you have to be calling using a random or sequential number generator, which no one uses anymore. That's like a 1990s technology that was in place when the law was passed. Mm-hmm. There's a Supreme Court case that said that you need to be using those technologies for um, uh, a calling mechanism to constitute an automatic telephone dialing system. In the modern world, because people dial from lists, none of those are automatic telephone dialing systems. So you're good.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Now, the one thing I should note is that if you're doing, artificial or pre-recorded voice calls, like those things are subject to TCPA, whether or not you're using an ATDS.
Okay, so that's important, guys, because I know the Mojo Dialer product, they have that recorded message where two people answer at the same time. Okay, because you're using a triple line dialer, two people answer at the same time. One of them gets a message, "Hey, this is Barry. I was checking to see if you're home. I'll call you back in a second." That's exactly what he's talking about. That's like a pre-recorded message. That's a no-no when it comes to this whole TCPA topic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another one that just popped in a few more times and up above. So remember, this does not apply to listing alerts. Those are going out via email, right? So you can still send those out if you don't have opt-in, or if somebody opts out to phone calls or text, you can still send listing alerts. They can opt out from those separately. So if somebody does opt out, or you feel you do not have the one-to-one consent, no, you do not need to go turn off listing alerts. The listing alerts are going to help you get that consent, because they come in and click on things and request a showing or ask a question or any of those are going to be the tools that Ylopo is putting in front of them that help you get this opt-in and consent. So this has nothing to do with email, only call and text.
Well, that was fun.
Got a lot. There's still a few in here.
This was, I can tell, like, as you can see, Mike, this is a topic that's been really, really on a lot of people's minds. So I really appreciate you diving deep for the community and G helping to facilitate it.
Yeah.
It's great to be here.
One question, I think I get asked this quite a bit. So if you're with the TCPA consent, Mike, can it be at the company level and then the agent is able to call, or does it need to be at the agent name level?
I would say it should be at the company level. And again, I know I can't say I'm like intimately familiar with how real estate agencies are organized, but if it's like G's real estate agent, and I'm like, hey, this is Mike from G's real estate agency, blah 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 blah, it's going to be a little tighter. But if it's just like, if it's just, hey, this is Mike calling you, and I don't mention like that I'm with G, it's a little looser. So it's a little smushy. I saw another one in there about what about groups? If it's like, the Mike Hazzard group. And again, it seems to me within the agency, within the group, it should all be fine. But again, it gets a little, it can get a little attenuated. You just want to be careful. You just want to make sure. I guess the question is like, the thing you should be thinking about is, would the consumer feel like that they, gave the consent? Now, if someone like leaves their agency and takes all the leads to the next place, and they're all from like agency A, and I'm now at agency B, that stuff gets people that hurt. That's a whole other kettle of fish, and there are a lot of hurt feelings to deal with there.
Yeah, and so on the Ylopo side, just to be clear, like we are giving your team consent, right? So like we're taking your company name, Better Homes and Garden, NAGR, and that is who you're giving consent to, right? But what we don't do is say Keller Williams, or Better Homes and Garden, right? Like we're actually using your team's name, so I would kind of emphasize that, or your brokerage or whatever, the entity that you give us essentially.
And again, like if you ever have to show it, you have to show it the consent, who gave the consent, and you have to explain why you fall within it. So if you feel comfortable with that, you're in all likelihood fine. If you think it's like, if it seems weird to you, it's probably going to seem weird to somebody else.
Awesome. All right, guys, I think we're over. Mike, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. And by the way, guys, like, because of all of the texting and calling we do, like I am a student of this, and I bring to Mike all the time, like, hey, this person said this, like, what's your opinion, And so like, if you have questions on this, or frankly, if you have counsel that's telling you something different, like chances are, I'd be happy to talk to them and potentially loop Mike in to have that dialogue. We've done that, right? And so, like, I don't. Again, this is our council's advice. This is the operating philosophy behind how we are doing TCPA compliance. And I'm kind of open to hearing other perspectives and sharing that with Mike and having that conversation.
And I'm being asked, are we going to have follow-ups to this as this rolls out and things change, product changes? I'm assuming we're going to have updates. Like, this is why you should be coming to the webinars, office hours, all that. As we're rolling things out, notifications, features, and all that, this is where we're going to be updating you guys. So stay tuned and please watch for all these webinars so that we can get you guys the latest information on all of
Yeah, please attend our webinars. And as things change, we will obviously update our systems and let you guys know about it. Mike pings me every couple of weeks, like this change, or whatever's the case. So please attend.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks
Guys.
everybody.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks,
Be with
G.
you all today. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.